Welcome to the podcast Melody and Friends, where I will be taking a virtual tour around the world and interviewing all kinds of people. And today we are landing virtually in Cincinnati, Ohio with Dr. Barbara Steffens, and going to talk about betrayal trauma and sex addictions and how sex addiction and how partners can heal. So welcome to the show, Dr. Steffens.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, before we kind of dive into your specialty, your book, and all the wonderful things that you are doing for partners, let's just hear, for those people that don't know anything about Dr. Steffens, why don't you share just a little of your story with us?
Well, let's see. I'm trying to think of how to make it little of my story. So as a mom and a married woman, I went back to school and decided I wanted to be a counselor. So I got, my associate degree, my bachelor's degree, and then eventually went back and got my master's degree. And so I was doing a lot of good counseling work. I worked on staff of a church for a while, which was my favorite job. But a lot of work with women and children. And it just seemed like I was always being drawn to working with people who had either been abused or in some kind of relational trauma. So that was kind of the clinical work I was doing. So I was a licensed professional clinical counselor. And in retrospect, I can see that God had a design. At the time, I lost my job at that church, which was very sad. It was an incredible loss. And that's a whole story all of its own. But I didn't know that I needed that time until I needed that time. So I was looking for jobs, couldn't find anything. And then all of a sudden I had that day happen that probably a lot of the people that be watching this have experienced, that day when everything changed, that we now call D-Day, Discovery Day. And I just was at the computer and all sorts of stuff kept popping up and I didn't know what it was. And then I knew what it was. I just intuitively knew. I think in my spirit, I knew. And fortunately, because I was a counselor, I had some kind of way of conceptualizing what I was seeing. So long story short, there was a confrontation and I was one of the very, very, very lucky ones whose husband really confessed and really dove into recovery. Not saying it wasn't bumpy, it certainly was. And it certainly shook me to my core. It brought up all the, well, was this all a lie? And how did I not know? How stupid am I? Here I am, a counselor, and I couldn't tell, and I couldn't tell because he was hiding it really, really well. But along the way, I kept asking people for resources, and all the resources that people suggested to me, my counseling colleagues, kept coming up with chapters that described the person married to someone with sexual compulsion or sexual addiction as being a co-addict. And I'm thinking, I don't get that because I don't see anywhere else in mental health where you have someone with a problem and then you are automatically assessed and diagnosed with something else based on that relationship. So it never made sense to me. I kind of like threw it out, made myself available to be with women in a church setting. They were running groups for guys and they had nothing for women like me. So I said, yes, I would do it. And I just started to listen to what they were describing. And I would always ask this question, what was it like for you the moment that you found out? And they would all use these really violent, destructive, assaultive kinds of ways of describing it. And that's when I really started hearing trauma. So everything said I was co-addicted. I know that I was not. I know that I was not a codependent. How in the world was I enabling something I knew nothing about?
That's right.
I can't. So that set me on my next course. I was invited to be on staff of a nonprofit organization that was dealing with the sexualized culture and pornography in the culture. Took that job knowing full well that that was a shift that I probably wouldn't recover from. In other words, that was going to be my direction. And through that, was able to travel, met a lot of people, really started to understand better what sex addiction was, what it wasn't, and really felt called to go back to school to get my PhD, which was never on a list of fun things to do. But certainly I knew that I needed to do it for two reasons. One was I wanted to do research on partners. No one had done research on partners other than there was one on attachment style, but nothing. So I knew I wanted to do that. And I knew I was seeing trauma in partners that I was working with. So I measured for trauma. And so I found that at least in my study, which was done in 2005, it's been a long time now, that nearly 70% met all the criteria for post-traumatic stress. Indirect response of finding out about the sexual secrets. So that's kind of how it all started. And that's my story. The story is now that we're coming up on 49 years married next year. So obviously recovery's been really good and sweet, not without heartache and pain, but it's been solid and good and steady. And as a result of my research getting out there, and then I started to speak at professional groups, especially to professional groups of sex addicts, treatment specialists, about please stop calling partners co-addicts or codependent and see them as traumatized individuals, that has really started to shift. Well, it has shifted the field. In 2009, we published Your Sexually Addicted Spouse, How Partners Can Cope and Heal. And that's when the floodgates opened, because women found the book and they said, this describes me. This describes my experience. And then they started taking that book to their counselors and coaches and saying, this describes me. Please don't call me a co-addict anymore. So it's very rare you hear that word anymore, which is, if that's been my life's work, that's enough.
That's right. I would
because
absolutely.
It was abusive and harmful to so many women.
And let's talk a little bit about that, Dr. Steffens. We have this codependency model, co-addict model, like you said, where it's like you're the addict, you're the co-addict. But let's talk, just maybe define trauma. We hear this word thrown out there a lot.
Right.
Define trauma for maybe somebody that has never heard about trauma related to betrayal in a relationship with somebody that's struggling with sexual addiction.
Okay. Well, if you think of trauma in general, you think of it as something that you're not expecting. Generally, you're not expecting it. It blindsides you. And then your whole body reacts to that event in order to protect you. So your mind and your body go into high alert and respond to the threat. And so that's the trauma. So think of it as an event trauma. So kind of like if you were assaulted by someone. I use the term or the analogy of being carjacked. You get in your car, you think you're safe, and all of a sudden there's someone in the back seat who's putting you at risk. So for a partner, we believe we're in a safe environment, relatively safe environment. And then all of a sudden something happens to say, oh, this person that is supposed to be and has been my safe place is now the person who's put me at the greatest threat. That's traumatic. So it's physiologically traumatic, it's emotionally traumatic. I think it's spiritually traumatic. And so the body then responds. So you have high adrenaline, you're on high alert, and anything that remotely reminds you of that moment can set you into being triggered. So we use that word a lot. And that's just the body saying, I don't feel safe, I don't feel safe, and I need to be ready to run or collapse or freeze just to protect myself.
And what makes it so difficult is if it were a rape or assault, if it were hijacked, you can get away from that person.
Yes.
But you're married to this person. More than likely, you might be sleeping in the bed with this same person. Yes. And so that makes it really, really challenging for the trauma.
It makes it very difficult. Yeah. And if you talked with partners, and I'm sure for your listeners, they're going to, this is going to resonate. If we ask what's the biggest trigger for them, they're going to say something about their spouse, either their voice, their actions, just their very presence, Remember one person I talked to, it was their husband's hands.
Mm.
So that very person that you would naturally believe, if I go to them, I'm going to feel safe. Now that person becomes the person where they feel the least safe. And so they go back and forth between wanting to feel safe and feel close, and then wanting to move far, far away because, oh my goodness, you just ripped my heart out and you are the least safe person for me right now. But everything in me, because we're attached, we're in a relationship, says, I should be able to go to you. So it's just this crazy time of, do I want to be close to you because you're the one that helps me when I'm scared from other things, to now you're the one that terrifies me.
Come here, get
So
away.
it's
Come here, get
very,
away.
very hard. Very, very hard.
Interesting. A number of years ago, I met a woman, was working with a woman, Dr. Steffens, and she had, many times we may say trauma, something like Katrina or something like 9/11 or whatever. And I finally was working with a woman who was in 9/11. She was working in the bank when the Twin Towers fell. And then she had also been in a car wreck, really traumatic car wreck, where she had to relearn to walk. And then she'd been through betrayal. And
Right.
she literally, as we were unpacking her story, she said 9/11 and this car wreck didn't compare to the trauma that she experienced at the hands of her partner. And, obviously I wasn't in 9/11, so I didn't know that, but to actually hear from somebody who had been in it with debris falling and running for her life, she said that the betrayal trauma related to her spouse was so much more traumatic. It was very interesting.
Yeah. And that's the hard part of betrayal trauma is it's the betrayal.
Mhm.
Trauma is trauma is trauma, and it's horrible. And it can take a long time to recover from. But betrayal, not only, I mean, usually with betrayal trauma, there's not a physical injury like there would have been in a car accident.
Right.
But there is an emotional injury, a spiritual injury, just a relational injury. There's this cutoff from the whole world. If I can't be safe here, where in the world can I be safe? So I do think it's much more global, to use a word. So it touches everything.
Yeah.
Whereas in a car accident, I might be scared to get in a car for a while. It
Right.
may take me a while to regain my strength. And like for the person you talked to really heal physically. But it doesn't affect everything. And betrayal trauma does. It affects everything.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what does it look like. So we've talked about, betrayal trauma and how it impacts a woman, a wife, a betrayed spouse. Obviously, safety is going to be super, super important. But related to the person that's struggling with the sexual addiction, what does it look like when somebody struggling with sexual addiction is in a good place? And then what does it look like when they're not? Like, what would some of those behaviors look like for somebody struggling?
Well, it's going to take a while. Let's
Mhm.
just start there. It's going to take a while to really be able to determine if they're in a good place or not a good place. Because at discovery, let's face it, probably the person with the addictive behavior is under a lot of stress. They may be traumatized just from the idea of, oh my goodness, it's all out there now. What in the world's going to happen?
Yeah.
And then it's going to take them a while, if they want to choose recovery, to start to demonstrate those behaviors. Most people, after being found out, will go into getting some help for themselves, hoping to put everything back, putting it back, like back to normal. I'm going to make it all better, and then she'll be okay, and then I can breathe. So when it's really going to move towards recovery is when that individual with the addiction says, I'm going to do this even if our relationship doesn't last, because they're doing it for themselves. So that's the first indicator. Early on, it's going to be, I want to be out of trouble. I want to make you happy. I want this. I want to fix this. And that's a normal place to be. But you're looking for that switch to, I am committed to doing this no matter what. I'm hoping that you will come along. I will do whatever I can to help you. I'm responsible for your pain. And this is what I'm doing, but I'm doing it for me as well as for us. So that's the first thing you're looking for, is real commitment to a lifestyle of recovery. So it looks like consistency over time. Not that they're not going to mess up once in a while, but that you see, I kind of think of it as a graph. You're looking for a trend line moving forward. And so you're going to see this, but if you see the trend line moving forward, they're getting stronger, they're more consistent, then those are good signs. Taking responsibility for rebuilding trust, that belongs to the person who broke it. That's their responsibility. No surprises. If there's going to be a change in routine, you identify and you notify about the change in routine before it happens. It's being vulnerable. It's saying, I have no secrets, and making anything and everything available. So it really is a heart posture, as well as it is a psychological posture, as well as it is a spiritual posture. And
what about if some of those things aren't happening? Like, what if she asked for some of those things, for boundaries, for safety, like transparency, or I'd like to know if you're going to go to this part of town that maybe you were acting out in, or hotels where you were acting, and he doesn't provide those things.
Mm-hmm. Then I would be curious as to what's going on that he's not willing to do that. Sometimes it's coaching the partner around making a request and giving the reasons for it. Mm-hmm. And then saying, and if you can't do these things for me, then I'm going to feel less safe with you, and I'm going to have to keep my distance because you're not behaving in a way that's helping me feel safer. So part of it is languaging for the partners so that they're really clear, this is something I desperately need, and this is what I'll do if he can't give it to me, because I will need to protect myself. But yes, if there's a defensiveness and you don't need all that, and you're just controlling me, and my therapist says blah, 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 I wouldn't necessarily believe that if he says my therapist says. But then that's more of a defensive posture, not an open posture. But again, that might take a little while before they get to that place. Yeah. And so in the meantime, if they're not at a place of being willing to share that information, then you're going to be working with someone else, getting support on what can I do to keep myself safe no matter what he chooses to do.
Yeah, that's good.
Not the best case scenarios, but it is something that the partner can do, even if their spouse is not cooperating with helping provide a sense of safety and without that openness. Yeah. But that's what you're looking for, the openness and lack of defensiveness.
Right. And would you say that many women that are going through the betrayal trauma piece, do you find that some of the acting out behaviors are more difficult for them to move beyond, or do you think it's more the lying and the deception and the, all the other behaviors that contribute to the addictive behavior?
I would say that the behaviors probably can drop off pretty quickly, but that lifestyle, that way of managing life, of being hidden or deceptive, those are the longer term changes. And so you may find that someone, if let's just say pornography is the issue, and they're able to have good boundaries and not use pornography, but they still find themselves lying over the smallest things, or being reluctant to be fully honest and to fully disclose all of their behaviors.
Right.
Because that they've developed this lifestyle of keeping it separate and keeping it secret. So being vulnerable and having integrity. Integrity just means you're the same person inside and out and in all situations. So learning integrity for someone with sex addiction, that can be the longer process.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. So I'm going to show y'all my beautiful book here that I've had. I think I found your book in 2012, 2013,
Okay.
Dr. Steffens. And it was a game changer. Like you said, I mean, all we had really had was books on codependency and things like that. And even though it didn't sit right, it was like, what do we have and where do we go? And, a lot of counselors are not trauma informed. So 2005, I think, is when you said that you began all this research, correct?
That's when I finished the research. That's when I
Okay.
did my dissertation. Yeah.
Okay. And how did that evolve into a book?
Well, I was speaking publicly around partners and trauma.
Uh-huh.
And I got a call from a woman that I knew of. We had met one time. It was Marcia Means. And she said, Barb, I'm getting ready to write a book based on your research. And I would love to write it with you, but I'm going to write it without you if you don't want to come along. And I said, oh, with please. And so we decided that we would co-author the book. So she was really the driver. She had written books before. She was a trained writer, as well as a gifted coach and clinician. So I'm grateful for her because otherwise I don't know if I would have written it. I would speak about it all day long, but really writing the book, it was Marcia saying this needs to be written.
That's awesome.
So
and there's a rewrite for that now as well, correct?
Well, it's really an update
Okay.
in terms of we changed publishers. We had to change publishers. And so there's just a few refreshes in it, but it's not a rewrite. It's a brand new cover that's not triggering. The first cover, I don't know how old your copy is, but the very first cover was very triggering to a lot of partners. So they would just rip the cover off. And now it's a very pleasant cover with like a leaf and a hand. Nothing crazy, nothing triggering. So, yeah.
Well, I'd love to talk a little bit about, I know that many times when a spouse has gone through something like this, there's shame for her around it, because here, I'm married to this person. I'm not understanding all that there is to know about this. And where she goes next is going to be really, really, really key. And even if she has your book, there is going to be some validation and how to cope and all the things. But if she goes to a counselor that's not trauma informed, if she goes to her pastor, who doesn't understand sexual addiction, there can be even more harm done to her. So let's talk a little bit about that, and how, if you are a ministry leader, coach, counselor out there, how can they be better informed to walk with betrayed spouses and or sex addicts?
Oh gosh, I hope they want to be informed.
Me too.
Because the stories I have heard from women who have gone to their faith community looking for help, so often so much harm is done there. And it's not that people don't have a desire to be helpful, but they didn't have enough desire to get informed on how to be helpful. And sometimes they give really bad advice, dangerous advice. So yes, if someone really, really wants to know on how not to harm, I don't expect them to be the person that's going to help. I want them to be the person that's going to validate and listen and not harm, and then refer. So find, if you're in that kind of setting and you really want to be that safe person, then find someone that you know who understands this and ask them to tell you about it. If there's someone in your community that you know has lived through this, invite them in and say what helped and what hurt, and learn from them. Put yourself in the learner position, and understand that someone who's going through this is going to know a whole lot more than you. So that's one step you can take. So be vulnerable and be open to learning, and to acknowledge what you don't know, which for most of us is hard. We want to know. And then take the step to get a little extra training. So I am part of APSATS, Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. I was the founding president for that organization. I'm doing training for them, no longer president. But we have just started a new training for people who are in religious communities, faith communities, who do want to learn more on how to apply this kind of trauma-informed perspective in working with both the person with the addiction and with the partner and with the entire family. So we've just started it. I've just finished the curriculum. We've just had our very first training. And we are ready, willing, and able to support you and help you get the information that you need so that you can provide good service and good support. Again, no expectation that you are the counselor. Faith leader, excel with what you are well trained to do, and then learn enough so that you don't hurt. But there's really good resources now developing to help you do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just say any pastor that's wants to be a shepherd of his flock can say, hey, I don't know a whole lot about this, but I want to get you to the right person. And probably, just nodding your head and seeing somebody and validating their story is a large percentage of the healing. So you really can be helpful in that, but then pointing them to the right place. And Dr. Steffens, tell them about the listserv. Okay. So for those that don't have, because I'm sure there's a minister out there who's like, one, I'm too busy, and two, I have absolutely no idea where to even start to get that person the help. So talk to them a little bit about the listserv.
Well, the listserv is specifically for people who have gone through the AppSets training. So what they can do, someone who's on the outside can just contact AppSets and ask, who's a good resource in my area, in my community, or what resources does AppSets already have as an organization that we can offer to those people. AppSets does have a directory of service providers after they reach a certain level in their training and supervision and certification. There's a directory that they can go to.
That's what I meant. Yeah,
the directory. That's open to the public, so they can go there. But just going to info@appsats.org, APSATS.org, they'll get directed to exactly where they need to go to find someone. But we are really developing.
And I'll put all of these links in the show notes
great.
So that everybody can know where to go. One other thing that I thought was that I love that you put in your book, you have a chapter from the hearts of sex addicts who get it. Yeah. And I love that because it really provides hope, especially if you're married to somebody who's maybe not working recovery. But what made you want to put that in there?
Oh, goodness. I think one of the main reasons is we knew that there were going to be a lot of women reading that book who aren't seeing that. And so we wanted to give them a glimpse of what it could look like for people in recovery who do get it, who do take responsibility, whether or not the relationship even survived, that they are doing well. So we did it for that reason. And it was another way, because Your Sexually Addicted Spouse is not a faith-based book, but the stories really show the faith and in God's work and the redemption that's possible. So we did a lot of that in the stories as well. So people could really incorporate their faith into what helped them as they told their stories. But mostly we wanted women in particular to see that it is possible and that this is what it can look like.
Yeah. And I love that you've really used different stories. But you had some stories in here from men who said, I realized that my actions ruined our marriage, the deception, how it impacted you sexually. It just was really helpful. And I love how you said that you provided that for women that may not be the hope story that they have, because restoration is definitely something that we want every woman to get to experience, but reconciliation may not, be something that is a byproduct of it, unless you've got two people that are really willing to work. So,
because reconciliation takes both, and it's initiated by the person who broke it.
That's so good. Well, is there where are you right now? I know you said you've rolled off as the president of the board, but are you continuing to do any writing, anything like that right now presently, or just seeing clients or?
I'm not doing any writing right now. We're talking about maybe a project, so we'll see how that goes. About a year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to write with Janice Cottle, who's a original member of the board of AppSets. And we finally have a chapter in a graduate counseling textbook about intimate betrayal and trauma. And so it talks about the betrayal and how it is traumatic. We refer to Jennifer Fried's research on betrayal trauma and apply it. We talk about a relational trauma model that APSATS uses. It's a 3-phase restoration model. In there, we give snippets on, case studies on what it can look like for recovery. But I'm just so proud of that now finally, for the professional field, there's at least one textbook with a really, really good chapter
That's awesome.
on what it's like when there's sexual betrayal, like our partner's experience. So
That's so good.
next step, yeah, I'm doing a little bit of coaching. Mostly I'm doing training and speaking. Going to speak at a conference this spring in St. Louis, where I'm going to talk about reducing harm in our faith communities. So I'm really looking forward to that.
That's awesome.
Doing the curriculum for APSATS now for the religious leaders on betrayal trauma. I think that's what God has for me right now, is to
Do you
really
see that?
incorporate my faith into everything else that I do.
So good. Do you see that chapter that you used in the graduate book? Do you see some version of that being in what you provide for ministry leaders and things like that to better understand the components of betrayal trauma? And
I think a lot of that is in there. That from that chapter, when we're talking to religious leaders, it's going to be, an overview of what trauma is, how this is traumatic, a lot of the things we've talked about, what causes harm, how to reduce harm. We're going to talk, if we're talking to religious leaders, about refraining from making any judgments and not being directive. A lot of times partners, women in particular, are left feeling made responsible, as if this wouldn't have happened if you had been more sexual or been more this or less that. And to help the religious leader really understand that addiction, really sex addiction in particular, is not about sex.
right.
Sex is what they're using to manage their mood state. So it's not that they're not being sexual enough. In fact, in a lot of relationships, the person with the sex addiction doesn't want to be sexual in the relationship. All that sexual energy is going other places. And so the partner is the one who's feeling sexually neglected, not the addict. But a lot of times, because people are ill-informed, they think it's about sex. And so if you just have sex more or differently or be more available, that somehow or another, that will fix it. And so partners come away feeling made responsible for what their loved one has done. That's one of the greatest sources of harm that partners receive, being held responsible for something they knew nothing about and had no control over, and it wasn't about that anyway.
Well, and I would say, just maybe you can address this as well. When women do finally get the courage to go to their church, many times they're saying, this is not a marriage issue. This is impacting my marriage, but this is an addiction issue. So I need to heal from how the addict is treating me, talking to me, the addictive behavior, and the addict needs to go get the help. But it's not, so many times they start focusing on the marriage.
Yeah.
It's not a marriage issue.
Well, and that happens when partners go to faith communities, but unfortunately that happens if they go to a counselor who is not trauma informed and doesn't understand betrayal trauma. They will also think of it as a marriage issue. Like, what is your part and what's his part? And there is no part here.
Right.
We have someone who is out of control with their behaviors, or if they don't reach a level of addiction, at least they're being deceptive and behaving in ways that the partner didn't consent to.
Right.
And so it's not an issue that there's a problem in the marriage. There's a problem that's impacting the marriage.
Right. That's so good. I like the way you phrase that. Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you would love to say to the ministry leader who might be listening today, just how they can better help couples?
I think being able to respond when people come to you is really, really important. to just be that good listener who's affirming and caring, and then refer, know your resources, but speak about it. If someone's not going to come to you around a really, really hard, painful, delicate issue if they've never heard it spoken in the larger community. So if you can't do it, invite someone in to talk about, what is going on in our culture? What is sexual addiction? And how is that different from other sexual sin? And is it sin, or is it addiction, or is it both? Even just having that kind of conversation. Because they're not going to trust coming to you if you never use the word sex or betrayal or trauma as you are doing your regular teaching and preaching. Bringing in guest speakers is a great way to do that. That way, if you don't like what they say, it's their responsible, not you. But have the conversations. I know that there've been a few churches where my husband and I have been able to go and just share story and then later answer questions. There are a lot of couples that are willing to do that. There's a lot of individuals that are willing to do that. So don't let the fear of I don't know enough to teach on it. Okay, then invite someone in who does.
Yeah.
Because that's going to demonstrate safety. If what they hear is nothing, or what they hear is don't sin sexually, whatever that means, someone struggling isn't going to come forward, and someone who's been injured in the relationship is going to be afraid to come forward.
That's really good. That's so good. Well, why don't you tell our listeners, again, I'll put all this in the show notes, but tell our listeners how to get in touch with you. And whether that's social media, your website, all the things, and I'll make sure all those links get put in the show as well.
Okay. Yeah, for me, on my website is drbarbarasteffens.com. And there you can find out about my coaching. Again, I say I'm semi-retired, which just means I've retired from this and I'm doing more of that. So I do a little bit of coaching, and then I do really want to help with education and support for faith communities. Also, APSATS, the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists, apsats.org, is a great resource, both for finding trained professionals and coaches, but also just for finding out how you can get more information and more training. And then you can get your sexually addicted spouse, how partners can cope and heal, in any online bookstore. Just be aware that sometimes just the title will take you to the old book, which is no longer in print, and someone will try to sell it to you for $100. So look for the cover that's green, and that's the new one. So put in your sexually addicted spouse 2021, and then you should get the right one.
That is hilarious.
It is pretty funny.
So they are still, I guess, in bookstores, but then obviously Amazon and all the normal bookstores have the new one, correct?
Yeah, they all have the new one. The online booksellers should be out of the old one. So it's resellers that they might link to.
That's so good. And I will just say, if you are a coach or a ministry leader, a counselor, the APSAS training is phenomenal. I got to sit under you all last month, and it just was so great. Not only just to get to learn all that, but to get to be a part of all the people that got to be a part of that as well, and just the practical tools and tips that are shared. But just I would highly recommend it. So the wonderful training.
Yeah, we love doing them. I've been doing them since the very beginning. I've trained everyone that has gone through the APSATS training, and it's a delight.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time today and the work that you're doing. That has absolutely been a game changer for so many of us that have walked, in betrayal trauma. So thank you. And I'm excited to continue to see what's next. So
yeah, me too. Thanks so much for all you do.